Good morning and welcome to this conference. The hall is not overflowing with ardent people who want to know more about Muslim minorities, but there is a pre-Islamic Arab poet who said, "Innal kirama qalilu," the noble people are few. And therefore, we shouldn't be devastated in any way that this august audience is not so large. Ladies and gentlemen, when the issue of minorities is discussed in the context of Islam, one usually thinks of non-Muslims living under Muslim rule. This topic, including the Dhimma problem, has been extensively studied since the beginning of modern scholarship. The study of Muslims living in non-Muslim majority countries has been given far less attention. This situation is now going through a process of change because the significant growth of Muslim population in Western Europe and in the US, the problems relative to their integration in local societies, and various political events which took place in, or I should say terrorist attacks which took place in the US, in England, in Spain, and elsewhere, all these factors combine to heighten both public and scholarly interest in Muslim minorities. The number of Muslims in non-Muslim majority countries is now estimated at about 320 million Muslims, and this figure includes about 170, perhaps more, Muslims in India, who constitute the largest Muslim minority in the world. It is appropriate to start this historical survey of Muslim minorities by noting that Islam started its history when the first Muslims were a subjugated minority in the city of Mecca. They were subjected to pressure, and some suffered even torture to force them to renege on their newly acquired monotheistic faith. This religious persecution resulted in two migrations, hijras, from Mecca. First, a hijra of some Meccan Muslims to Abyssinia around 615, and later the more famous hijra of the Prophet Muhammad and most of his supporters to Medina. The idea that Muslims should not live in a place ruled by non-Muslims who deny them religious freedom became a rather central idea in Muslim religious thought, at least in the formative period of Islam. Now, in the Muslim ethos, these two migrations were caused by the fact that the early Muslims did not enjoy religious freedom in their city. The period characterized by this lack of religious freedom for Muslims lasted for only 13 years, between the emergence of Islam in 610 and the hijra to Medina in 622, though some Muslims remained in Mecca and lived there under non-Muslim rule until the conquest of the city in 630. This short period acquired only a limited importance in the Muslim ethos, though we shall see later that the Meccan, quote-unquote, Meccan Islam has a place in the modern discussions on the question of minorities. Nevertheless, the period of Mecca is important because it gave rise to this idea that Muslims should not live under non-Muslim rule because the freedom to perform religious commandments is an essential part of Muslim religiosity. Now, the assumption in the classical Muslim traditional literature is that as a matter of principle, non-Muslim rulers will not accord religious freedom to Muslims. This is reflected in several Quranic verses which create a necessary connection between belief and migration from non-Muslim territory. You can see one such verse on your handout in passage number 1. As you see, there the angels will say, "Was not God's earth wide so that you might have emigrated in it?" This is to say, why did you remain under non-Muslim rule? You could have moved away. And this is, we also have this idea in the prophetic tradition, in the Hadith, and there is a tradition according to which the Prophet himself denounced Muslims who lived among polytheists, and he said, you have it in passage number 2. Passage number 2, I am free of responsibility for any Muslim who lives among the polytheists. Ana bari'un min kulli muslimin yuqimu bayna adhur al-mushrikin. Now, please note that the context of this tradition is the context of paying blood money to people who were killed while residing among non-Muslims. And when I come to the end of my lecture, you will see that this is one argument which allows the most modern thinkers about the problem of minorities to say that this is not a general prohibition of living among the infidels. This is just a matter which is specific to the payment of blood money, and residing among infidels in general is permissible. But in the classical literature, this is the atmosphere. One should not live among polytheists. You see, there is the next tradition at the end of this, of passage number 2, لا تساكنوا المشركين ولا تجامعوهم فمن ساكنهم أو جامعهم فهو منهم. He who associates with the polytheist or lives with him is like him. Now, it stands to reason that the original context of both the Quranic verse and the Hadith was to encourage hijrah from Mecca or from the tribal areas in Arabia to Medina. But its significance was later expanded to include the migration from any country under non-Muslim rule. The fact that in later periods some of the countries in which Muslims lived were ruled by non-Muslim monotheists rather than by polytheists has become immaterial. Now, the situation of the Muslims was dramatically transformed by the phenomenal conquests of the 7th century. As the conversion of the conquered population to Islam was a slow process, the Muslims remained a minority in the occupied territories for an extended period of time. But since the Muslim minority was a ruling one, the Quranic verse and the Hadith mentioned above were not applicable to the new situation. In the eyes of the Muslim traditionists and jurisprudents, the crucial issue was not the composition of the population, but rather the identity of the ruler. We cannot go into detailed investigation of the question for how long the Muslims were a minority in the various regions occupied in the 7th century. The classical Muslim historians are interested in the conquests themselves, in the building of the Muslim empire and of its institution. The demography of the territories and the changes in the religious affiliation of the vanquished population are almost completely disregarded. In view of this predilection of the classical historians, question of immense importance to the modern historians are difficult to solve. By way of example, decades of research on the question when Egypt became a Muslim majority country is inconclusive. The conventional wisdom is that it took at least 5 centuries, but this is far from something which can be documented. It stands to reason that during the first 4 centuries of Muslim history, few Muslims lived under non-Muslim rule. However, this situation was not destined to last. Beginning with the 11th century, significant areas conquered in the past by Arab Muslims reverted to non-Muslim rule. The island of Sicily, conquered by the Aghlabi rulers in a series of battles in the 9th century, was conquered by the Normans at the end of the 11th. The Muslims were given conditions which can be perceived as similar to what they themselves were used to offer to non-Muslims under their rule: autonomy, payment of tribute, and freedom of religious observance. It seems that much of the Muslim cultural elite migrated in the wake of the Norman conquest to Spain or to Ifriqiya, while those who remained accepted their existence under non-Muslim rule as legitimate, and one of their jurists asserted that the rulings of judges appointed by the Christian rulers should be seen as valid. Simultaneously with the reconquest of Sicily started the long process of Christian reconquista in Spain. And this reconquista gave rise to the emergence of Muslim communities under Christian rule, known as the Mudehars al-Mudajjanun, those Muslims who were left behind after the Christian conquest. And these communities existed in Spain under changing circumstances until the completion of this process at the end of the 15th century. We should also know the subjugated Muslims of Frankish Levant during the Crusaders period, which was this was investigated by Professor Kedar in an extensive article. Now, with the shrinkage of the Ottoman Empire, new Muslim communities came under infidel rule. Crimea in 1774, Bosnia and Herzegovina at the end of the 19th century. Now, I would like to devote most of my presentation to the development of Muslim legal thinking on the permissibility or otherwise of living among non-Muslims. In medieval Muslim thought, various views have been expressed on the question whether Muslims can live a fully Islamic life under infidel rule. We have already seen the tradition in which the Prophet is reported to have frowned on those who live among the polytheists. Again, the assumption of classical Muslim jurisprudence is that infidel governments will, as a rule, deny freedom of religious belief and observance to the Muslims, and the Muslims should therefore emigrate from areas ruled by non-Muslims. It stands to reason that the prevalent perception of infidel rulers as denying religious freedom to Muslims is based on the experience of the Muslims and on the traditions which relate to the situation in Mecca before its conquest by the Muslims in 630. Now, the issue of hijrah, the question of leaving non-Muslim areas into Muslim areas, is related also to the question of jihad. And we know that there are two concepts of the hijrah. One is the classical concept, which maintains that there is no hijrah after the conquest of Mecca, la hijrata ba'da al-fath. What remains is jihad. Intention and jihad, as the text has it. But there is also another concept, which we could call the open concept. And the open concept of hijrah maintains that there will be a hijrah after the hijrah. There will be a hijrah after the hijrah. And the tradition continues, the best people will go to the place where Abraham moved, the worst people will remain in the land, their land will seize them, and they will be resurrected with apes and should pigs. Not remain in a place which is ruled by non-Muslims. Now, it is reasonably clear that this open concept of the hijrah gained the upper hand in the Muslim tradition, and the traditions according to which there is no hijrah after the conquest of Mecca, la hijrata ba'da al-fath, never stood in the way of Muslims who intended to make the hijrah an element of their religious thought and practice, or of Muslim leaders who used the Hijrah as a strategy for mobilizing support for their endeavors. I know of two leaders of Messianic movements, Sayyid Muhammad Jaunpuri in 15th century India, and the Sudanese Mahdi, Muhammad Ahmad, in the 1880s, who demanded that their followers abandon their families and abandon their professions and perform hijrah to their camps as a condition of full membership in their movement. And as we shall see later, the issue of hijrah was still alive in the beginning of the 20th century. Now, the second issue which has to be discussed here are the twin concepts of Darul Islam, the abode of Islam, and Darul Harb, the area, the abode of war. In modern scholarship, there is a tendency to define Dar al-Harb as an area which needs eventually to be incorporated into Dar al-Islam by means of war. Now, to my surprise, I must say, I have not come across this definition in the works of the classical jurists. Now, this does not mean that these Muslim scholars opposed it. It seems rather that the concept of Dar al-Harb and its interpretation was so well known that they did not feel it necessary to elaborate on its meaning. However, the absence of a clear definition in classical jurisprudence is significant for the modern debates on the issue, because it enables some scholars to argue that the concept of Dar al-Harb applies only to areas which are actually at war with Muslims, or to areas which have no agreement with the Muslims. Dar al-Islam, on the other hand, is easier to define. It is an area in which a Muslim is the sovereign, Islamic law is enforced, and Muslims and dhimmis enjoy security. Now, I have said that the classical jurists assume that non-Muslim rulers do not accord religious freedom to Muslims. Yet this was not always so, and Muslim scholars had sometimes to grapple with a different situation. The first such case emerged in the 12th century when Transoxania came under the rule of the Karachitai dynasty, which did not embrace Islam, but allowed unrestricted freedom of religion to the predominantly Muslim population. Local Muslim rulers were retained over the overall authority of their non-Muslim overlords. Michal Biran asserted that the Karachitai policies created a situation in which at least Transoxania considered itself part of Dar al-Islam despite its infidel overlords. And this assertion can be substantiated by a very significant passage in Fatawa Fusul al-Ihkam fi Usul al-Ahkam by al-Marghinani, a Hanafi scholar who flourished in Central Asia during the Karachitai rule. And in a clear reference to the events of his time and place, he says at the beginning of the first chapter of his book, a very significant passage. You can see it on your handout in passage number 3. I have begun the book with the question in what way the abode of Islam becomes an abode of war, since we need to know it in our time because of the infidel takeover of these parts. May God give them what will make them fortunate in this world and in the next. Now, this is not very common for a Muslim jurisprudent to felicitate in such a way a non-Muslim ruler who just took over parts of Dar al-Islam. But I have to say that the idea itself, the Dar al-Islam, which was taken over by infidels, remained Dar al-Islam, exists elsewhere in the medieval Muslim political and legal thinking, especially in the Hanafi school, This is a matter of later, and when I say later, I mean the 11th, 12th century and later. We have such statements also elsewhere, but it is certainly a very striking formulation. I have not read so far a statement in which Muslim jurisprudence says, Atahumullah ma yus'iduhum bihi fi darain. He felicitates these non-Muslim rulers and hopes that they will be happy in this world and also in the next. And then the same Marghinani goes on to marshal arguments supporting the proposition that Central Asia under the Karachitai remained Darul Islam. Quoting several Hanafi scholars, he asserts that Darul Islam does not become Darul Harb if any Islamic law remains in effect, even if the dominance of the Muslims ceased to exist. You see, وَإِنْ زَالَ غَلَبَةُ أَهْلِ الْإِسْلَامِ. So he maintains that the area is Darul Islam, though the government is in the hands of non-Muslims. Now, what other factors go into this equation? The area of Transoxania, he says, is not contiguous with the lands of war. It borders on Muslim areas. The infidels do not publicly introduce their laws in the area which came under their jurisdiction. The judges are Muslims, and the governors who obey the infidels are also Muslims. So we maintain that the area can remain Dar al-Islam. In every city where there is a governor on the infidels' behalf, it is permissible for the Muslims to perform the congregational prayers, the prayers on the two festivals, to appoint judges, to marry off widows, because a Muslim is in charge of all these matters. Now, how should a Muslim behave in such a situation? In plain modern English, I would say, if sovereignty is out of reach, we should strive for autonomy. We should ask the rulers to appoint a Muslim governor. And it will not matter if this Muslim governor or Muslim judge or Muslim khatib or imam was appointed by a non-Muslim authority. Now, this is one way of looking at a situation in which a part of Darul Islam came under non-Muslim rule, but of course this is not the only way to look at such a situation. And I would like to contrast the ruling of Al-Maghinani, to contrast it with the fatwa which was issued in the early 1490s by a North African Maliki scholar, Al-Wan Sharisi. In 1981, there was a publication of a huge collection of Maliki fatwas from Spain and North Africa, called Al-Mi'yar Al-Mughrib. And from there is this fatwa. So Al-Wan Sharisi does not deal with the policies of the Christian kingdoms of Spain toward the Muslims, and does not dwell on any specific persecution of Muslims. I am saying this because I want to stress that whatever I will present to you in a minute does not necessarily result from some anti-Muslim policies of these Christian kingdoms of Spain. It is a matter of principle. So he argues, and as I say, on the level of principle, that the accursed Christians, may God destroy them, took hold of the island of Sicily and of some provinces of Al-Andalus. استيلاء ملاعين النصارى دمرهم الله على جزيرة سيكيليا وبعض كور الأندلس. And then he asserts on the level of principle again that migration from the land of infidelity to the land of Islam is a commandment valid until the day of judgment. So also is the migration. You have the text in passage number 4, or parts of it. On the migration from the land of infidelity to the land of Islam is a commandment valid until the day of judgment. So also is the migration from the land of forbidden practices, falsehood, oppression, and religious persecution. Living with the infidels is tantamount to increasing their strength. It is a prohibition imposed by religion, exactly like the prohibition to consume carrion, blood, pork, or killing a soul without right. And he who deviates from religion, and he who does it, deviates from religion and leaves the community of the Muslims. In other words, if he remains in the land ruled by infidels, he becomes an apostate. Now, the demand to migrate is absolute, and though one Sharisi mentions once that the new rulers have banned the public manifestation of Islamic ritual, the demand to emigrate is not dependent on this. The demand to immigrate depends just on the fact that the area came under the rule of the non-Muslims. Now, I would say that the most significant developments in Muslim legal thinking on the related issues of Dar al-Islam, Dar al-Harb, and Hijrah took place in India. Now, Muslim incursions into the subcontinent began in the 7th century, and one may say that by the 13th century, most of the subcontinent was under at least nominal Muslim rule. In contradistinction to the Arab areas of the Middle East, which eventually became Muslim majority areas, in India, the Muslims constituted only about 1/4 of the population. I mean historical India, which is today, of course, divided into 3 states. Yet there were for centuries a ruling minority, and their minority status had therefore little impact on their political standing or economic opportunities. This situation was substantially transformed in the mid-19th century, when the gradual British takeover was formalized and India was incorporated into the British Empire. Even before that, probably after the British took hold of Delhi in 1803, Shah Abdul Aziz issued a fatwa in which he did not explicitly say that India was Dar al-Harb, but described it in a way which makes this conclusion close to inevitable. And you have this fatwa in passage number 5 on the 3rd page of the handout. I will not read the whole of it because time is short, but in any case, the description of the situation in North India, in Delhi, is such that he creates the impression, yes, India has become Dar al-Harb. Now, in most modern scholarship, the conclusion was drawn that Abdul Aziz implied that the Muslims must strive for the restoration of Islamic authority in India or migrate from the area under British rule. This interpretation was prevalent until the seminal work of the late Professor Mushirul Haq, who convincingly argued that this conclusion was wrong, that the real intention of Shah Abdul Aziz was completely different and was related to economic problems which the Indian Muslims encountered as a result of the British takeover. In more specific terms, and according to the view of some Hanafi scholars, the declaration of India as Darul Harb was intended to allow the Muslims to widen their economic activities by engaging in interest transactions with the Hindus and the British. In other words, the recommendation of Shah Abdul Aziz was that the Muslims of India acquiesce to their new status as a subjugated minority and make most of it by getting involved in the new economy, which included interest transactions. Now, more vibrant intellectual debate about the possibility to live an Islamic life under the British continued in India throughout the 19th century, but time will not allow me to go into all the details. There is the Faraizi movement in Bengal, which declared that the area is Dar al-Harb, but their conclusion was that it is forbidden to perform the Friday prayer because there is no khatib and no imam who was appointed by a legal Muslim authority. At the other end of the spectrum, we have Karamat Ali Jaunpuri, who formulated a well-reasoned statement fully justifying Islamic life in British India. And the thrust of his analysis is to give much less weight to the religion of the sovereign than to his policies. Since the British allow religious freedom to the Muslims, India remains Dar al-Islam. The Muslims are under no obligation to migrate from it, and they certainly have no reason to wage jihad against the British government. Now, the question whether India is Dar al-Islam or Dar al-Harb came to the fore again in the 1920s in the context of the Khilafat movement, when a few tens of thousands of Muslims responded to a fatwa which demanded their migration to Afghanistan. This was a great fiasco because people lost their belongings, and maybe we will hear something about it from Professor Malik tomorrow. This is why I said that the issue of hijrah was alive in the beginning of the 20th century. And there I would also like to hint at what I will not be able to speak about, that this question, how should Muslims live under British rule and what is the legal situation and how should one grapple with it, was a subject of debate in the 1930s between no other person than Maulana Maududi and Munazir Ahsan Gilani, but I can't go into the details of this. I would like to jump to the period of independence of India and give you some review of another statement about the legal status of India by a gentleman called Saeed Ahmad Akbarabadi, who was a prolific Deobandi alim and published in 1968 a book called Hindustan Ki Shar'i Haysiyat, the Shar'i status of India. Now, this book is an attempt to define the Shar'i status of India since the British takeover, and most importantly, after the establishment of independent India. In order to understand his position, I have to note that Akbarabadi was a member of the Jam'iyatul Ulama Hind, an association of Indian ulama who opposed partition, maintained that all Indians belong to the same nation despite the religious differences, and supported the Indian National Congress in the independence struggle. Now, of course, if this is his general view, he will use the most restrictive conditions for the definition of a country as Dar al-Harb. And he maintains that domination, istila in the language of the classical jurisprudence, istila by non-Muslims, this domination takes effect only when the Muslims have no say in the government of the country and enjoy no religious freedom. if they are debarred from the government but do enjoy religious freedom, the area still doesn't become Dar al-Harb, and therefore India cannot be described as Dar al-Harb. It is a secular, democratic, secular Jumhuri in Urdu state. The government is not in the hands of any one religious group, and one cannot claim that it is dominated by infidels. The equality of civil rights guaranteed by the Constitution means that the Muslims have a share in the government. They enjoy full religious freedom. Neither India nor any other democratic country can be considered Dar al-Harb. But India is also not Dar al-Islam, because it declared itself a secular and non-religious state, secular or la dini in Urdu. It is not Dar al-Ahd or Dar al-Aman, the area in which there is a contract or an area in which there is security. It is not one of these either, because the relationship of mu'ahid, amin, or musta'min do not exist in modern times. So what is India after he denied the applicability of the classical Shari criteria? India is a national home for the Muslims. Now, national home is very far removed from Shari criteria, but Akbarabadi doesn't hesitate to consider this new definition as a Shari category. I have some other things to say, things which were said by another Indian Muslim scholar, but they go in the same direction as Akbarabadi, so I will skip the other gentleman. But I would like to finish my presentation with the new development. The decades which followed the Second World War saw a development which was not envisaged in traditional Muslim thinking, and I would call it a reverse hijrah, which is to say migration from the Muslim world to areas outside it. Now, this phenomenon and the subsequent emergence of new and significant Muslim minorities in non-Muslim countries provided an impetus for the development of a new branch in Islamic thinking entitled Legal Theory for the Muslim Minorities, Fiqh al-Aqaliyat. Our conference will devote considerable attention to this phenomenon, and I would like to make only some preliminary remarks. One of the thinkers who developed this field is Yusuf al-Qaradawi, and among the matters which he discusses in the framework of this new legal branch of legal thinking are economic questions such as the permissibility of trading in stocks and bonds. Does doing so violate the Muslim law that prohibits paying or receiving interest? And in general, the permissibility of deriving new rulings from the sacred sources of the Sharia. Qaradawi maintains that since the Muslims are a community with a global mission, they must have a presence in the West, because the West is a leading force in the world, and they must influence its policies. Now, from the point of view of traditional Islam, of the Quranic verses and the prophetic traditions which I mentioned to you, this is a problematic statement, and Qaradawi is fully aware of this difficulty and mentions in his main work on the Fiqh al-Aqaliyat, on the laws for the minorities, traditions which need to be explained away in order to give legitimacy to his assertion that the existence of Muslim minorities in the West is Islamically acceptable and even necessary. He achieves this goal by using the traditional methods of hadith criticism, known in the Muslim tradition as al-jarh wa ta'dil. This is to say examining the chain of transmission of a hadith and deciding whether a hadith is authentic or not. For instance, this tradition which I mentioned to you, I am free from responsibility for any Muslim who lives among the polytheists. This tradition has a weak isnad, it has a weak chain of transmission, and in addition, it means only that a Muslim who lives among the polytheists is killed by error. The Muslims are not responsible for paying the blood money to his surviving relatives. As for the hadith, he who associates with the polytheist or lives with him is like him. It refers to idol worshippers only, and the scripturaries, the Christians in our case, in Europe, are not in this category. How could we act according to this hadith, he who lives with polytheists, etc.? How could we apply this hadith when Islamic law allows wedding Christian or Jewish women? But you will see immediately that this is a problematic matter for Qaradawi. But classical Islamic law does allow it. Now, in this way, methods of traditional hadith criticism were employed to explain away traditions, which stand in the way of giving legitimacy to Islamically acceptable living in the West. At the same time, he does not hesitate to reformulate important Shari'i laws in view of the peculiar circumstances faced by the Muslims living in the West. He devotes considerable attention to the question of marriages between Muslim men and non-Muslim women. As is well known, classical Muslim law does allow such a marriage, though some jurisprudence had various reservations concerning this practice. Qaradawi accepts this rule. He cannot not accept it. It is a Quranic verse. So he accepts this rule, but considerably restricts its applicability. The Christian woman must be a real believer. The fact that she was born in a Christian family, this is not good enough. She must not be an atheist. She must not be an apostate. She must not be a communist. And she must not be a Baha'i. And it is forbidden to marry a Jewish lady as long as the conflict in the Middle East is not solved. Another interesting ruling by Qaradawi concerns the situation which ensues when a non-Muslim woman married to a non-Muslim man embraces Islam while her husband retains his original religion. After surveying the views of classical jurists, most of whom say that in such a case the woman must leave her matrimonial home, Qaradawi rules that in the West such a woman should stay with her husband. The purpose of this ruling is to encourage married women to embrace Islam, to spare them the hardships facing women without husbands, and to give the husband an incentive to follow his wife into Islam. I think that the last is the same also in the classical times, but I cannot argue with Qaradawi. After much hesitation, Qaradawi also ruled that a Muslim living in a non-Muslim country is allowed to take a mortgage and pay interest on it because there is no other way open for him to acquire a house. In conclusion, we may observe that in Qaradawi's work, contemporary conditions and economic pressures prevailed over one of the most hallowed principles of Islamic tradition and allowed a reversed hijrah from the Muslim world to the West. it is also a significant example of the interpretive possibilities available to Muslim thinkers who want to move away from traditional rulings which are, in their view, inappropriate for contemporary conditions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes for questions to our speaker, and I'm sure he's ready.
In one of the cases that you referred to, you say there is the interpretation is polytheists doesn't mean the peoples of the book, but just pagans. How wide is this way of dodging such things? Because you also have that in Judaism, of course. So how widespread is this?
The Quran makes a distinction between the two, but in the legal literature, one frequently finds the idea that the Christians and the Jews are in some way polytheists. With the Christians, it is a rather easy proposition because of the Trinity. With the Jews, it is much more difficult. But there is a way, and the way is to quote a Quranic verse in which Uzair, which is sometimes identified with Ezra, that the Jews believe that he is the Son of God. Now, the Muslim traditionists were rather perplexed by this idea because it is a very strange idea, and they knew that the Jews do not argue that Ezra was the Son of God. But then some traditionists maintain that yes, there was one Jew called Phinehas who believed in this, and this is very strange. But we have statements in the books of law in which Jews and Christians are considered also mushrikun, polytheists. It is not a general thing, but it is possible. Now, Qaradawi is, of course, within the mainstream Quranic tradition when he says that the Jews and the Christians are not mushrikun. It is fine, but if you wish to look for other views, you will find them also.
If I have understood you correctly, you have referred basically to the Hanafi scholarship. Do you know about the point of view of other?
Yes,
other,
the opposite fatwa, which I quoted, is a Maliki fatwa, and it is very straightforward and very unequivocal. You must migrate from an area ruled by non-Muslims. There is a long statement in Al-Mawardi who also says that it is possible that the Darul Islam, which was taken over by non-Muslims, will remain Darul Islam. There is, you see, a great reticence on the part of the Hanafi scholars to allow for such a transformation. It is felt to be against the correct march of history. For instance, there are a few conditions which are necessary in order to transform Dar al-Islam into Dar al-Harb. One is that the laws of the infidels are applied. The second is that the area borders on Dar al-Harb, that it is not an enclave which can easily be recovered for Islam. And the third is that the Muslims and the Dhimmis enjoy security. And when we look again at the Indian situation, the situation is very complicated. On the one hand, it borders on Tibet, on Nepal, on China. On the other hand, in the West, it borders on Afghanistan. And very important, what is the legal status of the sea? The sea is Dar el-Harb, but still the western border of India is Muslim. So maybe these three conditions do not apply them. And it was discussed and discussed again even in the 1930s. And one of the central problems in the whole discussion was whether the Muslims are allowed to engage in interest transactions. You see, Maududi has a whole book called Sood, in which he discusses the various possibilities of integrating into this new economy. There are some Muslim thinkers in India who say that this was really the main problem, that these Hindus and the British take interest and pay interest and integrate, while the Muslims have the Quranic verse, Ahallallahu al-bay'a wa harrama riba. Yes, God allowed trading but forbade interest, and this is the source of all our problems.
How would you describe the stance of Sayyid Qutb?
I have not investigated it in detail, but maybe I wouldn't like to just I don't know. Maybe somebody here has any knowledge on this.
What was the question?
What is the stance of Sayyid Qutb on the question of Dar al-Harb, on living in the West? I don't know.
Well, thank you very much. Let me just ask you...
Excuse me, could you raise your voice a bit?
I was wondering about the notion of Dar al-Harb. Usually Dar al-Harb is translated into the abode of war, which ultimately means that this area is supposed to be conquered by the Muslims, vis-a-vis the abode of Islam. But from your narrative, it is a bit problematic then to consider Dar al-Harb as a place of war, actually. Because, as you pointed out, the Muslim scholars were very pragmatic and flexible in dealing with the issues like Shah Abdul Aziz and Jaunpuri and so on and so on. So, would it be possible, or could we think of translating Dar al-Harb in a more kind of a more meaningful way than the abode of Islam, of war? Because as I perceive, and this would also go with this idea of Qaradawi, who kind of brings more flexibility in the terms when he talks about Dar al-Dawah, for instance. There's a new space which has to be, in a way...
propagated, in which Islam should be propagated.
Yeah, something like that. And so I was wondering whether we could think of a different translation for that.
I can survey for you what we have. I have said that I have not seen this definition, that this is an area which should be conquered by means of war. I have not seen such a definition in the classical Muslim books of law. And as I said, probably everybody understood what is meant by that, and there is no definition. There is a Pakistani scholar, Mushtaq Ahmad, who has a lengthy article about this, and he argues that Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam are only matters of distinguishing between geographical jurisdictions. But this doesn't give you a very good answer to the question of the term, harb. This gives you only the distinction between two areas. Then we have the following. In the Arab dictionaries, there is a definition which is different from this common thing that this is an area to be conquered by the Muslims. And they say that this is an area which has no agreement with the Muslims. This is quite different, yes? Now, Mushtaq Ahmad says that the jurisprudence used the term Darul Harb because in their days, the Byzantine Empire and any other non-Muslim place which bordered on Islam was in a state of war with the Muslims, so they used the term Dar al-Harb. In the geographers not always use the terms Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam, though they have a very good opportunity to do it. They describes the borders of Islam, and they could have used. Usually they don't do it. They say Diyar Rum or Diyarul Furs. They give more a ethnic description of the areas. And there is one statement in one of the geographers about Abyssinia, and he says, Hum ahlu silm, laysu biharb. They are people of peace. They are not ahlu harb. They are not people of war. Now, this, of course, goes against the idea that the idea of the jurists, which seems to be this, has not filtered down into other fields of Islamic civilization. The jurists don't explicitly say what they mean, but they choose the term Dar al-Harb, and I have not seen a good different explanation of this. It is, the jury is still out in some ways. Yes, I mean, of course, we can do whatever we want, but as far as the jurists are concerned, they don't explicitly say what they mean, but they use Dar al-Harb. Now, it could be that this is an area which is at actual war with the Muslims. It is certainly an interpretive possibility.
Just to add, in Fatawa Alamgiri, for instance,
Yes.
In late 17th century, Aurangzeb's compilation, Harbi means precisely the Hindu subject, right? So that, of course, does not mean that the Muslims keep kind of waging war against the Hindus.
They are in power.
Yes.
Yes. And this is not a very good thing to speak about Harbis in Dar al-Islam. I mean, nobody will dispute that India under the Mughals is Dar al-Harb. Of course not. Though the majority of the population is not Muslim, but still, who cares about the majority? We care about the ruler, yes? So it is strange to speak about a Harbi in Dar al-Islam, unless he is somebody who comes for purposes of trade or whatever purpose, gets an aman, and he is a Harbi. But he has been given aman, he has been given a promise of security.